Hello and welcome to the Bartholomew School GCSE English Language Revision video for English Language Paper 1, Question 4. This is the evaluation question. This video is for students in Year 11 only. We're going to be working through the example paper on the text called A Rose for Winter. I'm going to be making some assumptions in this video, namely that you have already completed question 2, the language question, and question 3, the structure question on this paper, and therefore you've already read it at least twice and you have a printed copy of it. If you haven't and you don't know where to find it, pause this video and go to the first one in the series by typing in this code into your YouTube search bar. You need the text, the question paper, a highlighter and a pen and paper before you go any further. So pause now to make sure that you're ready. So what does the evaluation question look like? The format is always the same. It will give you a reader's opinion and ask you how far you agree. So in this example it says, focus this answer on the second half of the source from line 11 to the end. A reader, having read this section of the text, said, "We really get a sense of the strangeness of the scene to the narrator and how overwhelmed he is by it all. To what extent do you agree?" In your response, you could consider the impressions created by the writer, evaluate how the writer creates these impressions, and support your opinions with quotations from the text. And it's worth 20 marks. The question is asking you to evaluate. What does that mean? What are you actually being asked to do? To help you do this, you might have a bingo card with some keywords on it, something like this, that will help you. Or you might have something that looks like this, that reminds you of the two parts of this question. However you're approaching it, you need to remember that it's both about an opinion and about your analysis with subject terminology. It's important that you do both of these things. You need to engage with what the reader's opinion is that you've been given, and you also need to be finding techniques and analysing their effects. With this in mind, take a highlighter and a pen, pause the video, and reread the Rose for Winter text. Annotate around the edge any techniques or lexical choices that you notice that might help you to argue for, or perhaps against, the idea that the writer shows the strangeness of the scene and how overwhelmed the narrator is. Remember, it's from line 11 to the end only. You won't get marks if you quote from earlier in the text. Pause the video and do some annotation. So what techniques might you have picked out? Well, the passage begins with two lists that build up the impression of endless characters passing the narrator, which could give you an impression that he's overwhelmed. Delving more deeply, I might pick out the use of nouns that create an impression of increasingly bizarre characters, from the women and sailors to the ruffians, cripples and idiots, and then lastly the rather chilling ghostly blind. Within those lists, you could also look at the use of verbs, which shows the array of difference within the crowd, from the relatively recognisable hurrying and strutting to the more worrying and more eccentric movements of the less fortunate figures, crawling, waltzing and singing, stalking. Perhaps you notice the sensory description in the second paragraph, which could give you an impression of a narrator who is overwhelmed by the scene. We've got this list of 3 sensory verbs for what he's doing, which might suggest a sensory overload: feeling, seeing, hearing. You could write about the use of dialogue with the introduction of the young man towards the end of the extract. Or better yet, you could analyse the simile "like a wild animal at a waterhole," which suggests someone uncivilised and perhaps dangerous in that word wild, but also somebody desperate with that noun, the waterhole. Perhaps to challenge the statement, you notice that there is a use of light and dark imagery that suggests not so much strangeness, but rather fear, or the eerie and the unknown. The dark doorway, the dim light and the shadows create an impression of somewhere unsafe, and perhaps the narrator feels, you could argue, not overwhelmed, but apprehensive about where he is. To write a solid evaluation answer, I'd consider forming your paragraph like this. Firstly, you need to agree with or challenge the reader's opinion. Use a phrase like this. Then you need to justify your agreement or challenge by identifying a technique that the writer is using. Use subject terminology to do this. You could use one of these phrases. You then need to offer evidence in the form of a quotation or quotations. Better still if you can identify a pattern of quotations or language choices that the writer is using. And then finally, you need to pick out important parts of your quotation to analyse. You should be using words like implies, suggests, has connotations of to do this. The more you repeat this process in detail, the better your answer is likely to be. So let's have a look at an example. I largely agree that the writer gives a sense of the strangeness of the scene. To create this impression, the writer uses lists to build up the impression of a number of increasingly strange characters passing by. For example, he used lists of nouns to identify people in the crowd, moving from women and sailors to ruffians, cripples and idiots, and finally the rather chilling ghostly blind. The word ruffians implies that a number of people in the crowd are untrustworthy. The whole list implies that these very different people are all together, which is strange. Furthermore, the use of verbs in the list shows these differences in the crowd. Whilst the women are hurrying, the more unfortunate or eccentric figures are stalking or waltzing, which suggests they are either sinister or out of control. This juxtaposition of different people's moods continues to imply that these characters do not really belong together, which builds up the impression of strangeness, and the sheer number of different types of people also helps contribute to the idea that the narrator is overwhelmed. So what have I done in this paragraph? Well, I'm making sure first of all that I offer an opinion in relation to what the reader said. Here I'm saying I largely agree. I then show that I'm going to talk about the writer's methods that make me agree to create this impression the writer uses. Throughout my paragraph I'm using technical terms. They're not particularly advanced technical terms, but they are precise. I also make sure that I show that I am analysing all the way through. So I'm using that word implies and the word suggests repeatedly. An answer to this question is worth 20 marks. It should take you at least 25 minutes to write, and you need to protect 25 minutes in your exam to do this. You can use this video to help you finish off this answer, either by looking at the advice for what to write about, or by looking at the way to structure a paragraph, or both. Good luck with your response and with your exam.